All right, welcome back. So we're going to pick up with this next section of that particular document, History and Dispute, Volume 13. Again, the purpose of this is, well, it's manifold. So, in one way, it's helping me to be informed and to educate myself on a lot of this history. This is new to me, much of this. It's to, have a more holistic understanding because there's just a lot of conversation about this kind of stuff, especially within my community. But my ultimate focus, right, my ultimate aim is to certainly give more attention, honor, and homage to our existence and our time and our ethnogenesis here on American soil, specifically in North America. Because there's so much beautiful, rich, amazing history, ingenuity. Oh my goodness, here in the last few centuries, right? Which is a very long time. And so, I don't want to stay focused on these particular origins too long, but certainly, looking into it. What many of us are learning with doing a lot of our ancestry work nowadays is that we have ties and connection to natives on this land, even prior to transatlantic slavery. And so, yeah, it's a beautiful thing to start uncovering a lot of this stuff and getting a more holistic view of just who we are and where we come from. And my effort as well, in all of this, is an attempt to not just put a spotlight and focus on and really uncovering the significance and contributions of foundational Black Americans and our ancestors to the biomedical systems, and even, more particularly, the ethnomedical, and consequently the current Western herbal or complementary medical system, medicine system, I guess I should say, that we employ, not only in North America, but also, in many European countries, and how a lot of the ethnobotanical knowledge has also influenced or informed other systems of medicine in other parts of the world, and the origins of that, but also proving or disproving, my claim that we are descendants of a particular biblical bloodline and lineage. Because at the end of the day, just to share a little bit about my story, my mother, she's laid to rest, may she rest in peace and power. But I remember in my teenage years, coming home and her just constantly being on this exploration to find the truth when it came to who we were and God's word. And she would tell me, like, man, we used to be kings and queens, and I just hate that our story starts with slavery and ends with slavery, and I just know we were more than that. Like, what is our history beyond that and before that? And so she started looking into like Egyptology and all this other stuff, and I was like, nah, that ain't it, And then she later was like, yeah, nah, that ain't it. And not to take away from, a lot of the how can I say this? A lot of the innovation and ingenuity of that particular empire, right? And those people, truly amazing. But I don't believe that all Black people descend from Egypt or Egyptians. And I don't believe that particular groups of melanated individuals descend from them. And we'll discuss that at a later time. In other words, I didn't feel that that was a part of our history. Yes, it's the part of the history of melanated people, which is a beautiful thing. But I don't believe that it is the history of those descending from the particular tribes of Israel, the biblical bloodline, right? Coming from Shem, one son of Noah, his three sons being those responsible for, after the deluge or flood, populating the earth, so all of the peoples that we see today can connect their bloodline back to one of either of those sons. But I'm like, I don't believe that that is the history of the people here on this land. I don't, and I didn't at that time. And so for years, we were on a quest essentially to kind of uncover a lot of truth and understanding of like our origins and where we come from and who we are. And so that is why you know, I am devoting my life not only to the work that I'm looking to do within medicine and setting much of the record straight where that's concerned, especially within the ethnobotanical knowledge that's out there, because again, a lot of that tends to only sort of center or focus on, of course, um, European influence and then also African influence. But I believe that there is a lot that we're overlooking by doing that. All right, so let's dive in to this. All right, so did African slaves sustain their cultures in North America? Yes, slaves in North America managed to retain important elements of their cultural lives and practices, such as kinship networks, family structures, and religious beliefs. No, the shock of capture and the horrors of the Middle Passage caused slaves to lose connection with their African past quickly. Questions about the Americanization of African slaves have kindled a widespread and ongoing debate among scholars. In general, the debate has set those who believe that the slaves discarded their African past in the New World against those who believe that the slaves clung to their African culture and heritage. Sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, in The Negro Family in the United States, was perhaps the first to argue that probably never before in history has a people been so nearly completely stripped of its social heritage as the Negroes who were brought to America. The opposite view, that blacks had maintained their cultural inheritance, which anthropologist M.J. Herbalism introduced during the 1940s, initially attracted few proponents. In the turbulent political climate of the 1960s, however, Herbalism's thesis received considerable support from leftist and black nationalist historians eager to rediscover and commemorate African culture. The most extreme attempt to demonstrate the African character of slave life is that of Sterling Stuckey, who insists that slaves were almost untouched by Western influences and that their culture remained predominantly African. Although a disagreement inspired by such ideological passion is not likely soon to abate, the dichotomy of it all between American adaptation and African survival is deceptive. According to historian Peter Culkin, in American Slavery 1619-1877, African identity among blacks was, ironically, a product of their presence in America. Africans came from different regions, spoke a variety of languages, and practiced an array of customs. Most did not think of themselves as African. In the New World, however, consciousness of a generalized African identity became more important as a means of uniting disparate peoples facing the same oppression and exploitation. All right, that's like the overview. Here's the particular viewpoint, starting with yes. Over the last several decades, historians have debated the question of how much African culture influenced African American slaves. To argue that Africans left behind their cultural beliefs and practices upon their arrival in America is, in effect, to say that they somehow created out of nothing a slave culture special to the United States. We quite literally did. Out the mud. Out the mud. African slaves, in fact, brought with them many of their former cultures, rituals, and traditions and adapted these folkways as a means to survive their enslavement. In Slave Culture, Nationalist Theory and the Foundations of Black America, historian Sterling Stuckey argues that African American slaves were basically African in culture, fundamentally untouched by European and American cultural influences. Is this supposed to be like indigenous? Like, what is the American? Okay. It is also important to remember that the African culture that came to the United States was not, because it's crazy how they never really mention that, right? Like the indigenous roots and influences. But okay. Was not monolithic, but was instead a diverse mosaic of different cultures, languages, religious beliefs, folkways, and even agricultural practices. Because of this variety, a diverse assortment of African cultures took root, grew, and flourished in the soil of North America. Many tribal groups, however, shared some common geography, family and kinship patterns, moral values, and secular and sacred rituals. The majority of African slaves brought to North America came from Central and West Africa, a vast area that included Senegambia, the Congo, Angola, Nigeria, Dahomey, Togo, the Gold Coast, and Sierra Leone. The geography of the region ranged from broad, open savannas to heavy forest and swamp lands. Most of the area had a subtropical climate. According to historian D.C. Littlefield, although many slaves had never encountered the cold and sometimes harsh winters that they would experience in North America, they were often better equipped than their masters to cope with the semi-tropical environment they found upon coming to Virginia, the Carolinas, and other southern colonies. Slaves who hailed from Senegambia, for example, located at the western tip of Africa, found themselves living in a familiar climate when they arrived in South Carolina. Because of their ability to adapt, Senegambian slaves soon proved invaluable to Carolina rice planters struggling to establish farms and homesteads. These slaves also demonstrated their prowess at navigating the inland waterways and swamps of coastal Carolina through the use of canoes and yeah. Further, their knowledge of how to use nets and harpoons for fishing suggests that in important respects, the slaves were capable of surviving in their new environment. With the introduction of rice as a staple crop in the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country during the mid 18th century, plantation owners benefited from the knowledge of their slaves, many of whom came from rice growing regions in Africa. With the help of the slaves, English colonists soon learned a variety of different agricultural practices, including shifting whole cultivation and, in some instances, crop rotation and fallowing. Slaves from Senegambia also helped to develop the cattle industry in South Carolina. Again, drawing out their experience in Africa, these slaves implemented the practices of free grazing, nighttime penning for protection, and seasonal burning to freshen pastures, all of which were routine practices in West Africa. Littlefield suggests that the word cowboy, which is usually associated with the Western Plains during the late 19th century, might have originated in Low Country, South Carolina, and Georgia during the 17th century. Some historians have argued that the African slaves in the Carolinas might have had an easier time psychologically in preserving their cultural identity and heritage because they were more likely to come into contact with large numbers of people from their own and related ethnic groups, and because they had comparatively little contact with whites. This assertion was certainly true of the Senegambians, who were preferred slaves because of their skills, knowledge, and stamina. Being thrown together allowed slaves from different groups to establish a network of moral, spiritual, and cultural support. All right, so this is kind of where your syllogism, the argument, is starting to fall apart. Oh no, this is in support of. No, yeah, this is where it's starting to fall apart, because for you to claim that they sustained it, to what degree? Because now you're starting to acknowledge that there were other ethnic groups, other people there that would influence and come together, establishing, in other words, religious, spiritual, cultural influence. Come on now. The greatest number of Africanisms, the cultural remnants from Africa and North America, persisted among slaves in the Carolina Low Country. We need to understand more about what this is and what they talk about. Anyway, the oldest surviving examples are found among the residents of the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, many of whom still speak Gullah and Geechee, which combine English words within an African grammatical structure. The expression, okay. We need to prove that. We do. But at the end of the day, it is still a morphosis of a different kind of speaking and language system. That's how languages are created. They use the symbols that are there and restructure them to create a completely different language. And so at that point, it's something different. And it should be distinct and respected as something different, not solely African in origin, because it was literally born out of a completely different experience. The expression of African culture also united form and function in the tradition of basket weaving and in the colonial ware pottery that developed among Low Country slaves. The akan-like drum and the banjo, which frequently accompanied black singing and dancing in the colonial South, were also of our. So I want to go ahead and plug right now Dewan B. If you don't know him, check out his channel. I will say that brother, man, does an amazing job at breaking down the history of our music, and that has been a deep focus of me here recently. A lot of musicians in my family, I myself, sang a little bit, a little song, something. Love, love, love music. It is just in our blood, and um, I've just been really interested here recently in regards to like the origin of our music genres and how they've influenced music in the world. Because I can't help but notice how every single genre has been penetrated by, especially Asians now, people who just are not, who don't really have the respect or understanding of where this thing that they're taking pleasure in and participating in really originates from, and honoring that. And it's not even that it originated from like we are a far gone people. Like, no, we are still here. The innovators of these genres are still, many of them still with us. Like, this is our music. And it's okay to acknowledge that. And in a sense, to gatekeep that. I mean, we look at other cultures in the world, especially in more like homogenous societies, and they take a lot of pride in being able to gatekeep, for lack of better terms, their traditions and their culture. And they're very apprehensive to let people just come in and monopolize that, aggrandize themselves on that, you know? And it's really just out of respect. It really is. I mean, in some ways, it's cool to see. And even it's cool to see sometimes the integration of different cultural influences on our music systems. But at the same time, it's just like not enough conversation. There's not enough being done to honor and respect the birth of these sounds. But I said all that to say that yes, there are some very few though African instruments that helped, that were integral and a part of those earlier sounds, but that quickly transformed, and Dewan B talks about that. I don't know what particular video it was, I can't remember, but check him out. Check out his website. What is it? Black Family Music or Black Family Music Tree, Black American Music. BAM, I believe is what it is. Y'all, my bad. But check that out, because, yeah, it's important. We really need to get back to understanding the origin of especially our music, which was bred out of our experience here. I don't care if I had a macaroni noodle that came from France, okay? If I had an onion that came from Africa, and then I had some cilantro that came from Italy, and then I had some other ingredients that came from South America. Once I flip and dip and whatever and do what I do in the kitchen, what comes of that is going to be its own creation, regardless of the tools and resources used. Yeah, I can acknowledge that, hey, this came from dim. But that's not going to overshadow what was created. I'm not going to look at this, whatever this is, this meal, and be like, this is Italian food. No. You get what I'm saying? All right. Dun, 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 dun. African folklore persisted as well, a practice that modern griot storytellers have revived. Many African rituals found their way into the everyday lives of the slave. Sleeping arrangements were serious matters determined by folk customs. Often slaves slept with blankets pulled over their heads, even if their feet froze, in an effort to ward off evil spirits that might be lurking in the dark. Slaves built bedsteads. They positioned them to face east to west, as in Africa, so they would not sleep in the crossing of. And I also want to say this too, right? Because we have to kind of set the record straight on this as well. And again, I'm not an expert. I'm not a historian. Okay? And forgive me if I'm coming off a little too authoritative in what I'm saying. But I do have an understanding that a lot of our ancestors were, some of them, for some people, never enslaved. Some, unfortunately, having enslaved others, still being melanated individuals. And there's many reasons for that, a lot of which is to, bring the family back together. And it's, it's definitely not in the same way that the Europeans would do that with us. But also, some of us were free. Like always, you know? And again, many of us were also native and indigenous. So, yes, right now with this particular part, we're focused on, these volumes regarding Africa, because I am, again, making an attempt to try to distinguish between who those prisoners of war were, who those particular people were sold into slavery that came over. But it is just a small percentage. And it is just a small part of our story. And at the end of the day, this again is the macaroni noodle, right? There were other things that played into the final dish, the final ethnogenesis, and who we became on this land. All right, I just want to make sure that I'm as clear as possible in stating that. But anyway, y'all follow me. It's all right. I know I'm all over the place. Okay, so they would not sleep in the crossways of the world, but would instead be in harmony with its rhythms. When slaves became ill, they might let the master or mistress treat them, but those who were suspicious of white medical practices either concealed their illness or turned to their own doctors within the slave community. These so-called root doctors relied on mixing various herbs and potions to treat any number of aches, pains, and ailments. Variations of these treatments had been used in Africa as well as in the Caribbean, and often combined medicine with magic, right? And that's what I'm saying is, like, in the telling of all of this, there were other elements at play. There were times when that was not the case. And what happened in the Caribbean, though significant, especially for them, is not so much relevant to what I'm, talking about when it comes to. So they didn't put a lot of work into being very distinct about different areas and stuff. Because as we read in that book, Africa and African, what was it, y'all, from John Thornton? Remember? When we read in that the treatment of different people varied immensely just based on the masters, their temperament, personalities, the regions. Like, there's so many variables that went into it, so many variations. And so the same is true of everything that was a part of living in that time, but we get so broad and general, all these generalizations, especially when we talk about the folk medical systems, because maybe there just isn't a lot of record, and so it's easy to do that. Like the case with Nat Turner. Check that out, parts 1 and 2, if you haven't seen the film that we kind of reviewed and I shared some sentiments on. But when you don't know a lot about something, you're just trying to make up conjecture at this point to rationalize based on your own interest and perspective what could be. And that's just human nature. Like, in a way, that's kind of what I'm doing, even with what I'm doing, right? But I want to make sure that I'm able to prove as much as possible the points that I am making. But yeah, I don't know. I kind of have an issue with that. But respect, to these places and these people. Listen. But nah, it's a little deeper than that. Anyway, masters and their families sometimes availed themselves of African folk medicine with their own remedy when their own remedies failed them. And that's my thing too, is like, this is not very accurate, because even though there were some seeds brought over, like black eyed peas and other things, which again would still transform to become something different here in the context of our experience here and in foundational Black American culture, a lot of the flora and the botanicals used for medicine in that time, many were native to the land here, especially in the South. And we can see that in a lot of the work of those early plant hunters and explorers, and even the work of the Portuguese and Spaniards that preceded them. And by the time that a lot of stuff started to begin to be introduced, much of it was not African in origin. So what are they say? African folk medicine was not the only system of medicine. I need y'all to really understand that was employed by those enslaved on plantations. It was not. It was not. And shame on them for not really putting in the work, but I understand it. No, I get it, because I think I may be one of the only people in my field, especially, furthering this conversation. Honestly, I don't know of anyone else. And that's not to say that I'm fully clicked in, you know what I mean? But I just don't know who else is really caring enough about this stuff. But I care deeply. This is my life's work, So I mean, they're doing the best with what they got, but that's not accurate. And then it's like, at what point did it change from African? If that's your claim, what point did it change from African folk medicine to African American? Anyway, certain rituals concerned with death were extensions of West African burial traditions, which stressed the safe journey for the soul of the departed and also sought to prevent ghosts from bothering the living. Those rituals included digging graves aligned from east to west, burying food and personal effects with the deceased to sustain them on their journey. Slaves also exhibited their African heritage in the practice of decorating graves with objects that have belonged to the deceased, such as seashells and artistically carved or sculpted grave markers. You know what? This is also the issue that I have, especially with a term like this that is so general. Because certain cultural practices and the differences of those, especially regarding death and other aspects of just living in that time, in any time, varied immensely from one, again, tribe, house, group to the next. So when we say African heritage, it's in these conversations, it's never really clear what African we are even talking about. And some African heritage is actually the result of history and heritage and practices and culture that predates a lot of those nation states in Africa. The land has been there, but the peoples and the influences have changed all throughout time. And here's another thing. I personally do not believe that mankind's existence, yes, though I believe they were definitely melanated people, I do not believe that Africa is the mother of us all. I do not. I believe it's in line with the word of God, and that it's close to Africa for sure. But I don't believe it is like Egypt or specifically on the continent of Africa. I don't believe that. And I believe that after the deluge, after the flood, like we read about in scripture, Ham and, that particular progenitor and all that will come from him were given that landmass and others to populate. But we did not originate from there. I don't believe the Garden of Eden was in Africa. I don't. Again, I do believe they were melanated people. Absolutely. But no, I do not believe that they come from Africa. But anyway, time is running out. This will be part 1 of this particular document. And then we will pick it up from here. Y'all like, comment, subscribe, share, and be blessed.